The winter of 1882 nearly killed everyone in Blackstone Ridge. Everyone except the man they all laughed at. While families burned through their last cords of firewood and children slept in their coats, one trapper sat warm beneath a frozen hillside, tending a fire no bigger than a cooking flame. He hadn't built a cabin. He hadn't followed a single rule the frontier had handed down for generations. And the man who called him the most dangerous fool in the valley, the best builder anyone knew, was about to walk through that hillside door and say nothing for a very long time. What did Gareth Holloway know that no one else did? And why did it take the worst winter in living memory to make anyone listen? Stay with us until the end. Hit like, subscribe, and drop the name of your city in the comments. We want to know where you're watching from. The cold came early that year. Not the kind of cold that arrives gradually, that gives a man time to stack his wood higher and check his roof seams and tell himself he's ready. This cold came the way a door slams. Sudden, final, without apology. By the second week of October 1882, the valley below Blackstone Ridge had already swallowed 2 early snowfalls, and the older settlers were studying the sky with the particular silence of people who recognized what was coming and did not like what they recognized. The ridge itself sat at elevation, roughly 4,000 feet above the valley floor, pressed against a north-facing escarpment of dark granite that blocked the afternoon sun from November through February. Settlers had been pushing into this territory for about a decade by then, drawn by the fur trade and by land that was cheap because it was hard. The pines up here grew short and thick, the kind of trees that spent their energy surviving rather than growing tall. The soil, where it existed at all, was shallow and rocky. Beneath the topsoil, clay. Beneath the clay, the deep subterranean cold of permafrost that never fully thawed, even in August. 19 families had built homes on or near the ridge. 16 of those homes were timber-frame cabins following the same rough pattern: squared logs, corner-notched, chinked with moss and clay, a single central fireplace of stacked stone, one window covered with oiled hide or, in the better-built homes, a single pane of salvaged glass. The other 3 families lived in variations: a dugout with timber framing near the creek, a stone-walled structure that belonged to the Halverson brothers, and a converted supply depot that the McCready family had bought off a trading company that pulled out 2 winters prior. All of them had the same problem: wood. It took an enormous amount of firewood to keep a person alive in Blackstone Ridge from November through March. Not comfortable, alive. The cabins, built fast and built for function, lost heat in every direction. Through the walls where the chinking had cracked and dried. Through the floor, where the cold earth sat directly under bare boards. Through the roof, where the heat rose and poured out into the sky while the people below shivered. A well-built cabin, on a brutal night when the temperature dropped to 30 below zero, and it reached 30 below here, had reached it multiple times, would reach it again. A well-built cabin could burn through a half cord of wood in a single night. Half a cord, one night. The settlers hauled wood from the lower forest, 2 miles each way, and they hauled it by hand or by sled. There was no other way to do it. The slope above the tree line was too steep for the horses. You loaded your sled, you hauled it up, you stacked it, and you watched it disappear into the fireplace week by week. By February, most families were rationing. By March, they were making decisions. How cold is too cold to get out of bed? How much heat do the children actually need to survive the night? Whether the fire could be banked lower, and they could sleep 2 hours longer before someone had to get up and feed it again. The children of Blackstone Ridge grew up knowing how to listen to a fire. They learned before they learned to read. They could tell, half asleep, whether the logs had burned down too far just by the sound, the way the snap and hiss of a healthy fire went quiet, went to embers, went to the kind of silence that meant you needed to get up right now or the temperature in the room would fall below freezing before morning. That was just how it was. Everyone accepted it, everyone except one man. Gareth Holloway had been in the territory for 11 years. He came up from the south, from a period of his life he did not discuss. If pressed, and people occasionally tried early on before they learned not to, he would say he had worked in several different places doing several different things, and then he had come north, and now he was here. That was the entire story as far as anyone was getting. He was somewhere in his late 30s, though he looked older in the way that men who spend most of their time outdoors tend to look older. Not worn out exactly, but weathered. Cured. Like wood that's been through enough seasons to stop caring about the weather. He set traps along 3 separate drainage systems, sold his pelts to a trading outfit that came through the valley each spring and fall, and had no particular dependence on the settlement except for what he could not produce himself. Flour, salt, lamp oil. He bought what he needed, traded where he could, and otherwise maintained a relationship with Blackstone Ridge that could best be described as adjacent. He was not unfriendly. He showed up at the settlement's occasional gatherings, the harvest meal in September, the trading days. And he would talk if you talked to him. He just didn't talk the way most men talked. He didn't fill silence. He let silence sit there, and some people found that uncomfortable, and those people had mostly stopped trying to have conversations with him. What he was, more than anything, was observant. He watched the way heat moved. He had been watching it for years, in different ways, in different contexts, long before he ever turned his attention to the problem of winter shelters. In his early years, working in the Southeast, he had spent time with a group of men who smoked meat, not the rough frontier way of hanging meat over an open fire, but serious, methodical, large-scale smoking operations that required managing temperature and airflow over long periods with precision. You could ruin weeks of product with a single error in how you built and managed your fire. The men who did it well were engineers, even if they never used that word. They thought about heat the way a river thinks about water, not as something to be created and consumed, but as something to be directed. He had also, in a period he was even less likely to discuss, spent time underground, not mining exactly. He had worked alongside miners in the hill country, the kind of work that doesn't have a clean job title, where you go where the work is and you do what the situation requires. He had spent enough time in tunnels and shafts and cut through passages to understand something that most people who lived their entire lives above ground never had occasion to learn. The earth holds temperature. Not perfectly, not without effort, but in a way that timber and stone stacked above ground never could. 8 feet down, the temperature of the soil stabilized. It didn't swing with the air. It didn't respond to wind. On the coldest night of January, 8 feet below the surface, the ground temperature in this territory hovered around 34 degrees Fahrenheit. 34 degrees was not warm, but it was not 30 below. And if you started from 34 instead of from 30 below, the amount of heat you needed to add to reach a livable temperature was a fraction of what you needed starting from the open air. He had been thinking about this for several winters, watching the families of Blackstone Ridge exhaust themselves hauling wood, watching children cough through February, watching men make the calculation year after year of whether this was still worth it, whether the territory was worth what it cost. In the spring of 1882, he started digging. The site he chose was on the south-facing slope of a low hill about a quarter-mile from the nearest cabin. South-facing was deliberate. Even in winter, the south face of a hill in this latitude received meaningful sun during the middle hours of the day. Not warming sun, not the kind that melted snow, but light. And light carried energy, and energy added to a passive system mattered. He cut into the hillside at an angle, working with a mattock and a long-handled spade, pulling the clay soil out in wheelbarrow loads and piling it to the side. The opening he cut was modest, wide enough for a man to enter with his arms at his sides, not wide enough to drive a sled through. He went back 8 feet, then cut left and expanded the space into a room roughly 12 feet by 16. The ceiling he kept low, 6.5 feet at the highest point, because every cubic foot of air above head height was air that had to be heated and that stratified warm air that rose away from where people actually lived. He did not leave the ceiling as raw earth. He cut timber, short sections of the dense, resinous pine from the lower slope, and fitted them horizontally across the ceiling span, then packed the gaps above with clay mixed with cut grass. Not because he thought the ceiling would collapse without it, but because the timber sections gave the clay something to grip, and packed clay sheds water better than raw earth. He had thought about moisture at length. Moisture was Victor Langford's primary argument, and it was not a stupid argument. An underground structure with poor drainage became a bog. He had seen it. He knew what it looked like. The drainage solution he designed was ugly, and it worked. He cut a narrow channel along the lowest edge of the floor, running toward the entrance, and filled it with small rounded river stones. Water that found its way in, through the ceiling, through the walls, through the entrance during a thaw, had somewhere to go. The floor itself he packed hard, added a layer of fine gravel, packed again, then laid flat stones salvaged from the creek bed. The stones were not perfectly fitted. They had gaps. The gaps were intentional. Airflow was the other problem everyone assumed he hadn't solved. A sealed underground room fills with carbon dioxide and smoke. This was not theoretical. It had killed people. Anyone who told you that an underground shelter was livable was either ignorant of the ventilation problem or lying about having solved it. Gareth was neither. He cut 2 passages through the hillside above the room. Narrow passages, 4 inches in diameter, lined with sections of hollowed-out pine log that he had cured and dried the previous summer. One passage angled down from outside air to the floor level of the room. The other angled up from near the ceiling of the room to exit on the hillside above. Cold air, heavier, fell in through the lower passage. Warm air, lighter, rose out through the upper passage. The result was a slow, constant exchange, enough to keep the air breathable, not enough to waste significant heat. He did not use a fireplace. This was the thing that confused people most, even people who were trying to understand rather than dismiss. A fireplace, a standard frontier fireplace, was a box that burned wood and sent most of the heat it produced directly up the chimney along with the smoke. You got warmth from radiation off the firebox and from the limited convection in the room, but a significant portion of the energy in the wood went straight out. Everyone knew wood fires were inefficient. Nobody had done much about it because timber was available and the alternative was unclear. What Gareth built instead was a masonry channel heater. He had seen a version of it in a different context, not as a home heating system, but as a kiln, a way of maintaining steady temperature in a confined space over long periods using controlled combustion. The principle was simple and the engineering was demanding. You built a long, winding internal channel from the firebox, a narrow channel, not a wide chimney, through a large mass of dense stone. The fire burned hot and small at the source. The combustion gases traveled through the channel slowly, releasing their heat into the stone before the cooled gases finally exited. The stone absorbed that heat and held it, releasing it slowly into the room over hours. The firebox itself was small, a box of fitted stone, roughly 18 inches by 20 inches, open at the front with a hinged iron door he had traded for 2 seasons' worth of prime beaver pelt. He fired the heater twice a day, morning and late afternoon, for roughly 45 minutes each session. During those sessions, he burned dry hardwood split thin, fast, hot combustion that drove heat deep into the stone mass. Then he closed the fire down and let the stone do its work for the next several hours. The stone mass was the size of a large wardrobe. It was the dominant feature of the room. It took up space that might have been used for other things. Gareth had thought about this and concluded he was fine with that. He chinked every joint between the stones with a mixture of clay and fine ash. He had experimented with this mixture the previous winter using a small test structure, a scaled-down version of the heating channel, built outside, used to understand the behavior of the thermal mass before committing it to the main shelter. He kept notes. Not elegant notes. A trapper's notes, short and practical, in the margins of a water-stained journal. Numbers. Temperatures measured with a glass thermometer he had paid too much for and treated with excessive care. Burn times. Cool-down rates. The time elapsed between firing and the point at which the stone surface reached peak warmth. The time elapsed before the stone cooled back to ambient. At its best, dry wood, correct firing, the stone mass retained meaningful heat for 18 hours. The entrance was the last thing he designed and the thing he thought hardest about. Wind was the enemy of any heat system. A straight-line entrance to an underground shelter was a wind tunnel. Every gust drove cold air in and heat out. He built the entrance as a right-angle turn. You entered through the hillside, turned 90 degrees into a short passage, then turned again into the room. Wind does not turn corners well. The right-angle entrance reduced infiltration from the outside by enough to measure. He finished in early October, just as the early cold arrived. Victor Langford heard about the project in July. He had not sought out the information. It came to him the way information traveled through a small settlement, through the ordinary channel of people talking at the trading post. "Holloway's digging himself into the hill," someone said. Langford was 44 years old and had been building in rough country for 20 of those years. He had come to Blackstone Ridge from a territory farther south where he had developed a solid reputation. Not flashy work, not ambitious work, but work that held up. Cabins that didn't settle badly, roofs that didn't collapse under snow load. He was the man people came to when they needed something done right, and he had given them consistent reason to trust that instinct. He had also, in those 20 years, developed strong opinions about what worked and what didn't. His opinions were not casual. They were built from experience, from watching other men's mistakes fail in real time, from the particular education that comes from being the person called in to fix what went wrong. He was not a man who dismissed things quickly, but he was also not a man who was accustomed to being surprised. He went to look at Gareth's site in August. He stood at the entrance for a while, ducking inside briefly, looking at the ceiling supports and the wall structure and the channel heater, which was not yet complete, and he came back out and stood in the afternoon sun and was quiet for a moment. "He's going to smoke himself out," he said finally, to no one in particular since he was alone. "Or drown." He did not say this to be cruel. He said it because he had seen underground structures fail, and he had a clear mental picture of how they failed, and what he saw inside that hillside matched several of those pictures closely enough to concern him. The drainage looked insufficient to him. The ventilation passages looked too narrow. He did not know enough about the masonry heating system to evaluate it, and that uncertainty bothered him more than the things he was certain about. Because when you're uncertain about a component of a system, you have to assume it might fail. And if it failed in a sealed underground space, the failure mode was not a cold night. The failure mode was death. He went to find Gareth. He found him at the site, cutting stone. "You've got a ventilation problem," Langford said. Gareth looked up. He set the stone down. "Tell me, those passages, 4-inch pipes, in a room that size with a fire. You'll have carbon buildup before the first hard freeze. The draw is passive. Cold air in low, warm air out high. I've tested the exchange rate." "Tested it how?" "Candle in the room. Timed the displacement." Langford looked at him. "A candle. 2 candles. I know what I'm looking at. A fire burns differently than 2 candles." "I know that too." There was a pause. Langford glanced at the heater structure. "What is that supposed to be?" Gareth explained the masonry channel system. He explained it briefly and without particular enthusiasm, the way you explain something you've already decided on and don't feel the need to defend at length. Langford listened. Then, "You're depending on the thermal mass to heat the room for 18 hours. Closer to 16 in the worst cold, yes. And if the channel clogs? If a joint fails under repeated heating and you get a crack in the channel and the gases bypass the stone mass and go straight out, then I fix the joint. If you're alive to fix it." Gareth picked the stone back up and looked at it. "I appreciate you coming out," he said. Langford stood there a moment longer. Then he left. He told 3 people about the conversation that afternoon. He told them that Holloway was going ahead with the underground shelter, that he had raised the relevant concerns, and that he expected them to be preparing firewood for whatever needed to be done in January when the situation resolved itself badly. The 3 people he told each told others. By September, opinion in Blackstone Ridge on the subject of Gareth Holloway's hillside home had organized itself into something close to consensus. It was going to fail. It was going to fail in a way that was either dangerous or fatal, and the only real question was whether Gareth would be willing to admit this before it became a problem, or whether they would find him frozen or asphyxiated sometime in late February when someone finally went to check. Margaret Austin, whose husband had died in a poorly ventilated root cellar 3 winters prior, came to find Gareth in late September. She was a practical woman with no patience for social performance of any kind, and she told him directly that she understood he was going to do what he was going to do, but she wanted him to have a plan for getting out if the air went bad. "What do you do if you wake up dizzy at 3 in the morning?" she asked. He thought about it. "I have the entrance." "Can you find the entrance dizzy in the dark?" He was quiet. "Put a rope on the door," she said. "From your sleeping area to the door, so if you can't see and can't think straight, you can still find out." He put the rope on the door. She was the only person who came to talk to him about it practically rather than coming to tell him he was wrong. He did not say this to her, but he remembered it. The first hard snow came on October 14th. Gareth moved into the hillside home that same week. He pulled the rough timber door shut behind him, lit the heater for the first time in its final configuration, and sat in the stone room while the fire worked through the channel and the heat began slowly to move into the walls. Outside, the temperature dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit before midnight. Inside, by the time the fire burned down to coals and Gareth closed the iron door, the stone surface had reached what he estimated, by touch, by the way the warmth moved against his palm, to be close to 90 degrees. The room itself settled at roughly 58. 58 degrees in a room. Outside, 8 degrees. He sat with that number for a while. Then he pulled his blanket up and went to sleep. The settlement did not know what was happening inside the hillside. They only knew that the smoke from Gareth's pipe vents had appeared for 45 minutes at dusk, and then stopped, and that the temperature outside had dropped to the lowest of the young season, and that no one had come scrambling out of the hillside in distress. Some of them went to bed certain the disaster was still coming. Some of them went to bed not quite as certain as they had been. The ridge was cold and dark and quiet, and beneath it, a man slept warm. The first problem appeared on the 23rd day. Not the one Langford had predicted. Not carbon buildup, not structural collapse, not the slow drowning of a poorly drained underground room. This was quieter than any of those, and in some ways more instructive because it came from a direction Gareth had not fully accounted for. He woke before dawn to a sound he couldn't immediately name. Not wrong with the air. The draw was fine. The room held its temperature. The faint sulfur smell of a dying coal fire was present and normal. The sound was wetter than anything mechanical. Slower. He lay still for a moment, identifying it the way a man identifies something in the dark. By elimination first, then by certainty. Dripping. He lit the lamp. The northeast corner of the ceiling had developed a stain, dark, spreading along two of the timber crosspieces, and at the lowest point of that stain a single drop falling every 4 or 5 seconds onto the flat stone floor below. A hairline crack ran diagonally across the clay packing between the timbers, no wider than a knife blade, roughly 14 inches long. Gareth set a tin basin under the drip, sat back on his heels, looked at it. The clay had cracked from thermal cycling. He had thought carefully about moisture from snowmelt. He had thought about groundwater. He had not fully calculated what 23 days of the heater bringing the room temperature up each morning and letting it fall each night would do to the ceiling, the daily expansion and contraction working on the clay, the way water works on stone invisibly until it wasn't invisible anymore. He pressed his thumb to the crack. The surrounding clay was not soft. The moisture was moving through and falling rather than spreading laterally into the timber. The crosspieces themselves were dry. The ceiling was not going to collapse. Not today. Not if he was careful. He drained the basin at midday. Refilled it by afternoon. Let the problem continue while he thought about it properly, because the worst thing he could do now was fix the symptom before he understood the cause. He found 2 other stress cracks before the week was out, neither seeping yet, both showing the same diagonal pattern, both in the same locations, where ceiling met north wall, where the temperature differential between the heater-warmed room and the cold earth of the north-facing slope was greatest. Thermal cycling. All 3 failures from the same source. He spent a day and a half testing a repair material before he applied anything. The problem with plain clay was that it was rigid. It sealed well when static, when the substrate it sat in didn't move. But clay packed between timbers that expanded and contracted daily with temperature was not static. What he needed was clay that could flex slightly. Not much, just enough to absorb the differential movement without fracturing. He had seen fiber used as a clay additive in a different context, a reinforcing technique for pottery that needed to survive heating. The principle translated. He shredded dried cattail stalks into fine fiber, mixed them into a prepared clay batch at a ratio he worked out by feel over several test applications on a section of exterior wall, and then applied the mixture to the ceiling cracks in 2 layers, pressing the first layer deep before the second sealed over it. He also applied a thin preventive coat along the entire ceiling wall joint in the north section. Not because it was failing, because it would. The repair held. He wrote about the fiber ratio in the journal, with a note that he had underestimated the thermal differential between heater side and north side surfaces. and that future construction should account for this with either a more flexible ceiling material from the start or a wider initial crack allowance packed with fiber clay rather than plain clay. Future construction. He was already thinking about the next one. Word reached Langford in the way most things reach Langford, through the ordinary current of a small settlement where nothing was entirely private. A man named Cress Dalton had passed the hillside site on a timber run and seen Gareth working on the exterior roof slope with a bucket and an unfamiliar tool. Langford came to the site 4 days later. He picked his way up the icy south slope in the early afternoon and found Gareth applying the fiber clay mixture along a section of the exterior where the earth covering met the entrance slope. "The ceiling failed," Langford said. He said it the way a man states a fact he expected to be stating eventually. Gareth didn't look up from the work. One section cracked, 2 others showing stress. Moisture intrusion. Minor. The basin caught it for 5 days while I worked out the repair material. Langford stood and watched the application. The fiber-reinforced mixture moved differently from plain clay. He could see that even without touching it, the way it pressed into the surface rather than sitting on top of it. He said, "That's not what I expected to see you putting on it." Straight clay will crack again. The thermal cycling differential in the north section is larger than I'd planned for, so I was right about the moisture. Gareth set down the paddle tool, looked up at Langford directly. "You were right that moisture would be a problem. You were thinking groundwater and snowmelt. This was condensation cycling in the clay. Different mechanism. Still moisture. If that's how you want to score it." A pause. The wind came off the north face and moved between them. "The heater," Langford said. "Any joint failures in the channel?" 2 minor separations. Week 2. Repacked with ash clay. Langford was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than a normal quiet. "Week 2, he said. "Yes. And you didn't—" He stopped. "Didn't what?" "You found 2 channel joint failures in week 2, and you didn't think that was worth mentioning to anyone." "I found them, I assessed them, I fixed them. They weren't dangerous at the time I found them." "At the time you found them." Langford's voice didn't rise. It did something more controlled than that. "If you had found them a week later, I would have found them before they were dangerous regardless. I'm checking the draw every day. A reduction in draw tells me the channel is compromised before the channel is compromised enough to matter. And if the draw indicator failed, if the reduction was subtle enough that you missed it for 2 days," Gareth picked the paddle back up, "then I'd have caught it on the 3rd day when I did a physical inspection of the channel joints." "You're inspecting the channel joints how often?" "Every 4 days. Langford looked at him. "That's not in whatever notes you're keeping." "It is now." The silence between them had a different quality from the silences in their previous conversation. That one had been the silence of 2 men who didn't know each other well enough to argue. This one was something else. 2 men who had now established enough of a working familiarity to be genuinely disagreeing about something real. "Holloway." Langford's tone shifted. Not softer, not harder, more direct. "I have no doubt you know what you're doing inside that room on a daily basis. That's not the argument. The argument is that if you are wrong about one thing you haven't thought of yet, there's nobody within earshot and nobody expecting to see you at any particular time. And the consequences of that one wrong thing are not a leaky roof." Gareth worked the paddle along the exterior joint. "I know that. Then you understand why I can't simply—" He stopped again. "Can't simply what?" Langford was quiet. "Say it." "I can't simply stop worrying about it," Langford said. "Is that what you want to hear? Fine. I can't. You've fixed what's failed so far. You've fixed it well, from what I can see. But each failure is a thing you didn't predict, and there's no way to know how many unpredicted things are left." Gareth sat back on his heels. He looked at the valley below them for a moment, where the afternoon light was going flat and gray. "That's true of any building," he said. "In any other building, the failure modes don't include suffocation." The word sat there. It was the first time either of them had said it directly. "No," Gareth said. "They don't." He didn't say anything else. Neither did Langford. The wind found the hillside again and moved over it, and then Langford said he'd want to see the interior before the heavy weather arrived, and Gareth said Thursday, and that was the end of it. The second problem arrived in December and was not quiet. A single low crack from the east wall sometime around 2 in the morning. Gareth had the lamp lit before the sound finished traveling. The wall held, but the floor had moved. 2 creek stones in the far corner had shifted. The mortar gap between them had opened from its original finger width to something near 1.5 inches, and from that gap, cold air rose in a focused stream. Not water, earth air. The particular cold of deep clay and stone, the temperature of the ground itself rather than the temperature of the room. He held his palm flat over the gap and felt it. The cold coming up was striking, 15, maybe 18 degrees colder than the room air. A direct channel to the substrate below, opened by differential settlement. The floor stones had always had gaps by design. He had designed them for drainage, for water that needed somewhere to go. What he had not accounted for was that the clay substrate under the stones would compact unevenly under load, the heater mass, the stone floor, the weight of the north wall bearing into the east corner, and that as the substrate compressed over 2 months, the stones above it would settle at different rates depending on how much load each section bore. He had packed the substrate before laying the floor. He had packed it once. What the floor had needed was time under load, weeks of the heater weight bearing on the clay, compressing it to its stable state, before the final stones went down and were mortared. He had understood drainage and missed settlement, 2 different problems wearing the same floor. He could not fix it quickly. To relay the affected stones properly, to repack the substrate in layers, and let each layer stabilize before adding the next, he needed to work in a cold room. He could not fire the heater while he was working on the floor beneath the heater mass. He made a decision and started pulling stones. 4 days. He worked in a room that hovered in the low 30s during the work periods, wearing every layer he owned, stopping when his hands stopped responding and warming them over a small oil lamp before continuing. He packed the clay substrate in 2-inch layers, tamping each one before adding the next, waiting longer than felt necessary between layers. He used fine gravel mixed into the clay in the lower courses for additional drainage capacity. He let the substrate sit under a temporary load of stacked stones for an additional day before relaying the floor. The mortar joints he set tighter than before. Not the drainage gaps of the original design. Those were now handled by the perimeter channel, which had proven sufficient. The floor needed to be stable, and stability required contact, and contact required tight joints. On the 4th night, he refired the heater. The room took longer to warm than he had ever recorded. The stone mass had cooled fully during the 4-day shutdown, and the floor stones were cold, and the whole system was starting from a deeper deficit than it had faced before. He wrapped himself in 2 blankets and ate cold food and sat in a room that held at 31 degrees and waited. By midnight, the thermometer read 48. By 2 in the morning, 53. He wrote in the journal by lamplight, settlement failure in substrate under thermal mass load. Repack schedule inadequate. Single-pass packing insufficient for loaded substrate. Multi-layer repack with staged loading required for final stone course. Time to stable room temperature after full system cold start, approximately 10 hours. Then he wrote, the system recovered, not as a note of relief, as a data point. Miles Donovan came to the hillside home for the first time on a Tuesday in mid-December. He came because his wood stack was running short. Not critically, he had perhaps 2 weeks remaining, but the weather preventing his resupply run was not improving, and a man with Donovan's experience did not wait for critical before he started paying attention. He knocked on the timber door. It was an odd sound, knocking on a door set into a hillside, and Donovan noticed it the way he noticed most things. Without expression, filing it somewhere. Gareth opened the door and stood aside. Donovan came in. He was tall enough that he had to duck at the entrance, and he moved through the right-angle turn without pausing, already looking at everything as he went. He stood in the room and turned slowly. He went to the heater and held his palm 6 inches from the stone surface. He looked at the ventilation pipe openings. He crouched and pressed on 2 of the floor stones. They didn't move. He stood back up. Wood, he said. What about it? Your numbers. What are you burning? Gareth told him. Current month, 61 pounds of dry split hardwood per week. Donovan's expression did not change, but he looked at the heater for a moment in a way that suggested he was doing arithmetic. 2 firings a day, he said. Morning and late afternoon, 45 minutes each. Stone holds all night. Until about 4 in the morning in the hard cold. Room drops a few degrees before the morning firing. Donovan walked to the south wall and stood near the small vent opening, where a thin column of pale winter light came in. He looked at it for a moment. Then, what failed? Ceiling cracked, thermal cycling in the clay, repacked with fiber clay. 2 heater channel joints separated, found them at day 11, repacked with ash clay. Floor settled under heater mass load, relayed the east section 4 days ago. Donovan turned. 4 days ago. That's why the room is still coming up. Gareth looked at the thermometer on the east wall. It's at 54 now. It'll be at 58 by morning. But you had 4 days with no heat. Yes. In December? Yes. Donovan was quiet for a moment, not an uncomfortable silence, the kind of quiet that comes from a man processing information that requires processing. How'd you manage? He said. Layers, lamp, cold food. It wasn't comfortable. Donovan looked at the ceiling. At the north wall junction where the fiber clay repair was visible if you knew to look, a slightly different texture, a subtle color variation in the material. He had been looking at construction details long enough to see things most people walked past. Langford thinks it'll fail, he said. I know what Langford thinks. He might be right. He might be. A pause settled between them. Outside, the wind had been shifting since mid-afternoon. Donovan had heard it change register on his way over, a lower frequency, coming from a different angle than the wind they'd had all week. My wood's running short, Donovan said. I know. I saw your stack 2 weeks ago. I was passing. Donovan looked at him. You were counting my wood. I wasn't counting it. I looked at it, and the number came to me. You were already going to be tight before the weather turned. Yeah. A pause. Didn't expect December to come in like this. Nobody had. This system, Donovan said after a moment. You didn't get it from somewhere, not whole. Parts of it. The channel heater I'd seen used differently, the earth insulation I'd learned underground, the airflow I worked out myself, the fiber clay I worked out here. The settlement failures. Also here. Donovan looked at the floor. The newly relayed section in the east, barely distinguishable from the rest, except that the mortar joints were tighter and the stones sat perfectly flat. I've been in this territory 18 years, he said. I've watched people build the same cabin every winter. Gareth said nothing. Same problems every winter. Donovan paused. Langford builds them better than most, but he builds the same thing. He builds what works. He builds what doesn't kill people. Donovan said it without judgment, without inflection. There's a gap between those two things. Neither of them named what was in the gap. Donovan pulled his coat back on. At the entrance turn, he stopped. The Halversons, he said. They're already rationing. McCready's too. I know. If this weather holds another 3 weeks... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The arithmetic was available to anyone willing to do it honestly. All right, he said. He left. Gareth stood at the closed door for a moment after the sound of Donovan's footsteps in the snow faded. Then he went to the heater and opened the iron door and checked the coal bed. Added 3 pieces of split hardwood. Thin, dry, the kind that caught fast and burned clean and hot. Closed the door. Adjusted the lower vent. The room temperature was reading 55 now, still climbing. He sat down and opened the journal to a fresh page. The lamp threw a steady light across the stone walls. The heater ticked its familiar tick. Outside, the wind was doing what the wind in this territory did when a real system was building. Not gusting, not varying, but maintaining a continuous, low pressure against everything that stood above the ground. The kind of wind that didn't announce itself dramatically because it didn't need to. He wrote the date, the temperature, the ventilation status, the firewood inventory. Then he wrote, wind, northwest sustained, pressure dropping, storm building, not tomorrow, day after tomorrow. He closed the journal. The stone surface read 89 degrees under his palm. In 4 hours it would be at 60, reading into the room at whatever pace the temperature differential demanded. In 8 hours it would be at 50, still giving up heat, still working. Somewhere in the settlement, a family was feeding their fireplace and watching the wood stack and doing arithmetic they didn't want to be doing. The storm was still 36 hours out. The stone had 36 hours of heat stored in it already. And above the hillside, the sky pressed lower and darker against the ridge, building towards something that had been building for weeks in the high atmosphere, and that would arrive on its own schedule, without regard for what anyone had prepared or failed to prepare, and would be as large as it was going to be regardless of what any person in its path believed about their readiness. The lamp burned steady. The room held its warmth. Gareth sat in the quiet and listened to the wind find the ridge. The thermometer cracked on the second morning. Not the room thermometer. That one was mounted on the interior south wall, sheltered, and read 51 degrees when Gareth checked it at first light. The exterior thermometer, the one he had mounted in a small alcove beside the entrance to get accurate outside readings, had split along its length sometime during the night. The mercury had contracted so far in the cold that the pressure differential shattered the glass tube from the inside out. He had never seen that happen before. He stood at the entrance and looked at the broken instrument for a moment. Then he went back inside and noted it in the journal. Exterior thermometer, glass failure from thermal contraction, estimated outside temperature, below instrument range, instrument rated to -38 Fahrenheit, below -38. The storm had arrived on schedule, the afternoon of the day after Donovan's visit, exactly when the pressure drop and the wind shift had suggested it would. It arrived not with drama, but with certainty, the way a door closes when someone has decided the conversation is over. The temperature had dropped 22 degrees in 6 hours. The wind had built from sustained to something that had no clean category, a continuous wall of moving air that drove the snow horizontal and reduced visibility to the length of an outstretched arm. That was 36 hours ago. The storm had not paused, had not varied significantly, had not given any indication that it was building toward a peak after which it would ease. It simply continued at the same relentless register, as if it had decided on a number and intended to hold it. Gareth fired the heater. The morning firing ran 50 minutes instead of 45. He had made that adjustment yesterday, reading the system. The stone mass was working harder now, releasing heat faster because the temperature differential between the room and the surrounding earth had increased as the ground surface cooled. The earth insulation was still doing its work, but it was working against a larger gap than it had faced in any of the previous weeks. He needed more heat in the stone to maintain the same room temperature. The morning firing brought the room to 56 degrees by 8 o'clock. He tracked it every 2 hours in the journal. By 10, it had dropped to 52. By noon, 49. The stone was releasing faster than normal. The numbers told him clearly. The external cold had increased the draw rate on the thermal mass. He would need to fire again at midday rather than waiting for the late afternoon session. He added a third firing to the day's schedule. Shorter, 30 minutes, at noon. Enough to push heat back into the cooling stone without running the fire so long that the channel joints were under extended thermal stress. 3 firings per day. 98 pounds of hardwood for the week at this rate instead of 61. He looked at his wood stack and did the arithmetic. He had enough. He had built his reserve for exactly this kind of deviation. But just enough was a different condition from comfortable, and he was aware of that distinction as he split additional wood in the alcove beside the entrance, working in the partial shelter of the hillside while the wind screamed across the open ground 20 feet away. On the other side of the settlement, Victor Langford was burning his fireplace at full capacity, and it was not enough. His cabin was the best-built structure in Blackstone Ridge. He knew this without arrogance. It was simply a fact of his work, that when he built his own home, he used the best techniques he had, and his techniques were better than most. The corner joints were tight. The chinking had been reapplied the previous September. The roof had a steeper pitch than was common in the territory, which shed snow load more effectively and reduced the compressive stress on the structure. None of that changed physics. A well-chinked timber cabin lost heat in direct proportion to the temperature differential between inside and outside. When the outside was below -38 and the inside was trying to hold at 50 degrees, the heat loss was enormous. You could quantify it by how fast the room temperature dropped when the fire was banked. In normal winter conditions, Langford's cabin lost roughly 8 degrees per hour with no fire. In these conditions, it was losing 14 degrees per hour meant that if the fire went out at midnight, the interior would be below freezing by 2 in the morning. He had not slept more than 2 consecutive hours in the past day and a half. His wood consumption for the previous 24 hours, 162 pounds of hardwood. His remaining stack, as of this morning, approximately 480 pounds. 3 days. If the storm held and consumption stayed at this rate, he had 3 days. He sat beside the fire in his coat and calculated this without panic, because panic was not a useful state, and he was not a man who allowed himself useless states. He calculated it, and he looked at the number, and he sat with what the number meant. Then he thought about Gareth Holloway's hillside home. He thought about the journal entry he had read on Thursday. Stone surface temperature at close, 87 degrees Fahrenheit. Estimated overnight drop to ambient, 4 to 6 degrees. 4 to 6 degrees. Not 14. He fed the fireplace another log and watched the flame take it, and did not say anything to anyone because there was no one in the cabin with him and nothing useful to say in any case. The Halverson brothers lost their fire at 3 a.m. on the second night. Not through negligence. Petter Halverson had been awake and tending it, but the wood they had brought in from the stack was wet through. It had been stacked correctly, covered correctly, but the storm had driven moisture into the stack from an angle they hadn't anticipated, and the outer 2 rows had absorbed enough water to make burning difficult. The inner rows were drier, but the inner rows were also the last rows. The fire went to coals, sputtered on wet wood, went lower. Peter fed it everything dry that remained in the cabin. A chair, 2 sections of shelving, a small table. That bought them 4 hours. By 7 a.m, the cabin interior was at 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and both brothers were wrapped in everything they owned and pressed against each other on the single bunk, not speaking. The distance from the Halverson cabin to Gareth's hillside home was roughly 400 yards. It might as well have been 4 miles in that storm. Gareth heard nothing. Inside the hillside room, the storm was a presence rather than a sound. A low-frequency pressure that you felt in the stone walls rather than heard through them. The earth above him was 4 feet thick. The earth around him was older than the storm, older than the winter, older than anyone who had ever tried to survive in this territory. It absorbed the wind's energy and returned nothing. At noon on the second day, he fired the midday session. 30 minutes, as planned. The stone surface read 71 degrees before he started, lower than the morning close temperature, which confirmed the increased draw rate. The 30-minute firing brought it back to 84. He made a note. Recalculated. The system was working harder. It was still working. He sat in the room at 53 degrees and ate a meal, dried meat, hard bread, melted snow water heated on the oil stove he kept for cooking, and thought about the structure around him. Not anxiously. The way an engineer thinks about a running system, tracking the variables, watching for deviation from the expected pattern. The ventilation draw was steady. He checked it with a short strip of paper hung near the lower intake. It moved in the correct direction, consistently. Fresh air in, spent air out. Not fast enough to waste heat, not slow enough to let carbon accumulate. The ceiling joints were holding. He had checked them that morning with the lamp held close, looking for new cracks along the fiber clay sections. Nothing. The floor was solid. He had one concern that he had not fully resolved. The entrance. The right-angle design reduced wind infiltration significantly. He had measured this in normal conditions, could feel the difference between the screaming wind at the exterior and the relative calm at the interior door. But in conditions beyond the instrument range, with a wind load he had not tested against, he did not have data. He had the feeling of the room. He had the temperature log. He had the fact that the room was holding. That was not the same as knowing. He put on his outer layers and went to inspect the entrance passage. The exterior was... He leaned into the passage and looked out. A wall of white. Horizontal white, moving fast. The cold hit the exposed skin of his face like a flat surface, immediate and total. He pulled back after 3 seconds and stood in the interior passage, where the right-angle turn had already killed the wind to almost nothing. The entrance seal was holding. The gap between the timber door and its frame, which he had packed with shaped felt, was not leaking in any way he could detect by feel or by the behavior of the small paper strip he held near the bottom of the frame. He went back inside. He sat down. And then he thought the thing he had been not thinking for 2 days, which was, what if the stone mass cannot sustain this rate of draw for a third day? He had not tested this. He had tested the system in normal operating conditions in the range of temperatures that December in Blackstone Ridge normally produced. He had calculated the reserve capacity of the thermal mass, and he had built in a margin. But he had built that margin against his expected worst case, and the broken exterior thermometer was telling him that the actual worst case was outside his expected range. He opened the journal to the thermal mass calculations he had done in October, read through them slowly. The stone mass weighed approximately 1,800 pounds. Schist and granite, dense and slow to heat and slow to cool. The specific heat capacity of stone, the amount of energy required to raise its temperature by 1 degree, he had estimated from reference material he had studied before building. The numbers told him that at full charge, the stone held enough thermal energy to heat the room for approximately 18 hours under normal conditions. Under normal conditions. He sat with that phrase. The current conditions were not normal. The heat loss rate from the room had increased. The stone was discharging faster. He had compensated with 3 firings per day. But 3 firings per day was also asking more of the channel joints, more of the firebox, more of every component in the system simultaneously. He thought about the channel joint failures in week 2. Fixed. He thought about the ceiling cracks. Fixed. He thought about the floor. Fixed. Everything that had failed had been found and fixed before it became dangerous. He could not calculate the probability of an unfound failure occurring right now, at this moment, in the worst conditions the system had faced. He sat with that too. The room temperature was 51 degrees. He looked at the thermometer for a long moment. Then he looked at the heater, the iron door of the firebox, the stone mass behind it, silent, working, giving up its stored energy to the room at a rate the room demanded. He did not know with certainty that the system would hold through a 3rd night at these temperatures. He knew that he had built it as well as he knew how to build it. He knew that every failure it had shown him had been a failure he could learn from and correct. He did not know what he didn't know. That was the thing. That had always been the thing. The thing Langford had said to him, "There's no way to know how many unpredicted things are left." And the thing Gareth had not answered directly because there was no direct answer to it. He added a log to the firebox. Not a scheduled firing, just 1 log, to put a small amount of additional heat into the system as insurance against the 3rd night. Then he closed the door and sat back and waited for the stone to decide. Donovan came at dusk. He came through the storm with a sled loaded with his remaining wood. Not all of it, but enough to represent a commitment. And he appeared at the entrance to the hillside home in a state that communicated, without any words, that something had happened in the settlement. Gareth opened the door. Donovan came through the entrance passage and stood in the room and took his outer layer off without being asked. Ice crystals had formed in his beard. His face was the particular dark red of extreme cold exposure. He stood at the heater and held both hands near the stone surface. "Halverson's," he said. Gareth waited. "Fire went out. Wet wood." Donovan's voice was flat. "I got there at 7 this morning. Both of them were okay. Cold. I brought them to my place." "Your wood." Running short. A pause. "That's why I'm here." They looked at each other. "How short?" Gareth said. "At current burn rate, 2 days." "How much did you bring?" Donovan gestured at the sled outside. 70 pounds, maybe 80. Gareth went to his own stack, counted, calculated. "I have reserve. I've been burning more than planned, but I built margin." "I'm not asking you to—" "I know, I'm telling you the number." Gareth turned. 90 pounds. I can give you 90 pounds and stay within operating margin for 6 more days at current consumption. Donovan was quiet. "What about Langford?" Gareth said. "I haven't been to Langford's." "His stack was adequate last I saw it. He'll be burning heavy, but he built well." Gareth paused. "He'll be fine for 2 more days. After that, the storm has to break." "Yes." Donovan looked at the room. He looked at the ceiling, the fiber clay patches, the steady stone above. He looked at the floor. He looked at the thermometer on the south wall, reading 50 degrees while outside the mercury had shattered its glass tube. "What's your room at?" he said. 50. Donovan had nothing to say to that. His own cabin, when he had left it with the Halverson brothers inside and his remaining fire burning at full, Had been reading 31 degrees. Sit down, Gareth said. I need to get back. Sit down for 10 minutes. You're showing exposure. Donovan sat. He held his hands near the stone and said nothing. The heater ticked its slow tick. The storm pressed against the hillside and the hillside absorbed it. After a while, Donovan said, Does it always hold like this? In the worst of it, Gareth thought about the question honestly. About the broken thermometer. About the third night calculation he had done an hour ago and the margin he wasn't certain about. So far, he said. Donovan looked at him. That's not a yes. No. Another silence. Donovan pulled his outer layer back on. The wood, he said. I'll sled it over in the morning. Donovan nodded. At the entrance turn he stopped. Langford came by my place yesterday, he said. Before the worst of it. Asked if I'd heard from you. Gareth said nothing. Just, he asked. Donovan paused. That's all. He left. Gareth stood in the room. The door was closed. The storm was a presence in the walls, in the stone, in the deep cold pressure of the earth above him that was working against the stored heat in the heater mass every hour of every night. The room temperature was 50 degrees. Outside was a broken thermometer and a white wall and wind that had been building since November and had arrived finally at its full intention. He fired the evening session, 45 minutes. He watched the temperature in the stone rise and held his palm to the surface until it was too hot to hold. 89 degrees in the stone. He wrote it down. He banked the fire. He did not sleep immediately. He lay in the dark and listened to the storm try to find its way through 4 feet of earth and 2 feet of stone and the right-angle entrance and the felt-packed doorframe and all the other decisions he had made since spring, each one a layer between himself and the cold that had broken a thermometer rated to -38. The stone held its heat. The room held its 50 degrees. At 4 in the morning, it had dropped to 46. He fired the morning session early. By 6 o'clock, the room was back to 52. The storm had been running for 60 hours. The wood stack was lower than planned, but within range. The heater had not failed. The ceiling had not failed. The floor had not moved. No one was here to see any of it. No one was measuring it except Gareth, alone with his journal and his thermometer and his palm against the hot stone in the dark. No one was counting the degrees or noting the firing times or observing that the room had held within a 6-degree band for 60 continuous hours, while outside the instruments gave up and the mercury retreated until the glass couldn't hold it anymore. The system had done what it was designed to do. The storm was still running. And outside, in the cabins that stood above the ground and offered their heat to the open sky through every seam and joint and thin timber wall, people were waking up cold and feeding fires that could not keep up and doing arithmetic that told them things they were not ready to hear. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. Not gently. It stopped the way it had started, without transition, without the gradual easing that storms sometimes offered as a kind of courtesy. 1 hour the wind was running hard across the ridge. The next hour it was not. The sky remained low and gray. The snow remained deep, but the pressure that had been pushing against every surface for 78 hours simply withdrew, and the silence it left behind was the particular silence of a landscape that had been worked over thoroughly and was now still. Victor Langford was outside before the wind had fully stopped. He did not go to his wood stack. He did not assess his cabin for damage. He did not do any of the things a man normally did in the first hour after a major storm. He dressed in his heaviest layers, pulled on his boots, and walked directly toward the hillside. He walked fast, not running. Langford was not a man who ran toward things, but with the particular pace of someone who has been waiting to do something and has finally been given permission to do it. The snow was thigh-deep in the open ground between the settlement and the hillside. He pushed through it without pausing to find an easier route. His breath came in short clouds. The cold was still severe, so perhaps 15 below in the post-storm air, which felt almost mild against the memory of the previous 4 days. By the time he reached the base of the hill, his coat was wet from the exertion, and his face was burning from the cold, and he had not stopped moving once. He stood at the entrance to the hillside home. The timber door was closed. The ventilation pipes on the hillside above showed the faint shimmer of warm air meeting cold, barely visible, but there. He stood and looked at those pipes for a moment. Then he knocked. Gareth opened the door. Langford looked at him. Gareth looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched longer than was comfortable. Then Langford stepped inside. He stood in the entrance passage and felt the wind die. One step inside the right-angle turn, and the screaming cold of the open ridge simply stopped. He stood there longer than necessary, in the passage, before he continued into the room. The room was at 53 degrees. He knew this before he saw the thermometer because he could feel it. The particular quality of warm air after days of cold so severe it had physical weight. He stopped inside the door and stood very still. He looked at the ceiling. The fiber clay patches were visible if you knew what you were seeing. He knew. He looked at the floor, at the tight mortar joints of the relayed east section. He looked at the heater mass, the iron door closed, the stone surface radiating a warmth he could feel from 6 feet away. He looked at the ventilation pipes, the small paper strip hanging near the lower intake, moving gently in the correct direction. He looked at the thermometer, 53 degrees, outside 15 below zero. A differential of 68 degrees maintained through 78 hours of the worst storm Blackstone Ridge had seen in at least a decade, using a fire that burned 45 minutes at a time. Langford stood in front of the thermometer for what felt like a long time. He was a man who read construction the way other men read text. He could look at a joint and understand the decision that produced it, could look at a roofline and calculate the load distribution, could stand in a room and feel the quality of its engineering the way a musician hears the structure beneath a melody. He had been doing this for 20 years. He was doing it now. Reading the room. Reading what was in the room and what was not in it, and what the gap between those two things meant. What was in the room? Warmth, stable air, dry surfaces. A heater that had been running for 60-plus days without catastrophic failure. What was not in the room? The smell of smoke. The smell of dampness, the scorched wood smell of a fireplace pushed past its capacity, the sound of a fire being fed constantly to stay ahead of heat loss, the particular exhaustion of a man who had been waking every 2 hours for 4 days to tend a fire. Gareth was sitting at the small table, eating. He did not look like a man who had survived a crisis. He looked like a man who had been working steadily and was taking a meal between tasks. Langford pulled his coat off and sat down across from him. Gareth pushed the bread toward him without being asked. Langford took a piece and ate it and said nothing. After a while he said, "Your wood." "Within range." "How much did you burn?" "Total for the storm period, 312 pounds over 4 days." Langford thought about his own consumption over the same 4 days. He had burned 648 pounds. He knew his number exactly because he had been counting every piece that went into the fireplace, the way you count things when the count matters. He did not say his number out loud. He set it next to Gareth's number in his head and looked at them together. 312, 648. He looked at the heater. "The channel joints," he said. "Held. Throughout. Throughout." Langford put his elbows on the table. He looked at his hands. The hands of a man who had built things for 20 years, who could feel the quality of a joint by running his thumb across it. He said, "I was wrong about this." 4 words. He said them the way a carpenter sets a final nail. Not hard, not soft. Exactly as much force as the job required and no more. Gareth looked at him. "Not about everything," Langford continued. "The moisture concerns were legitimate. The ventilation concerns were legitimate, but the fundamental..." He stopped. "I was wrong about the fundamental." Gareth said, "You came out here expecting to find something failed." "Yes." "And you're going to have to decide what to do with what you found instead." "Yes." Langford looked at the thermometer again. "I've already started deciding." Donovan arrived an hour later with the Halverson brothers behind him. Peter Halverson was 37 and had the particular look of a man who had been cold for 4 days and hadn't fully processed that the cold was over. He came through the entrance passage and stopped when the warmth hit him. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the wall of the passage. His brother Edvard came in behind him and stopped at the same spot. Neither of them spoke. Donovan came in last and looked at Langford, who was still at the table, and at Gareth, who had stood when the door opened. The 5 men arranged themselves in the room, not awkwardly, but carefully, the way people arrange themselves in a space that isn't large and that they haven't all shared before. Peter Halverson walked to the heater. He held his palm 6 inches from the stone surface. He held it there for a long time. "Still warm," he said. "It fired an hour ago," Gareth said. "It'll hold until mid-afternoon." Petter looked at him. "My cabin was at 14 degrees this morning." Nobody said anything to that. "I was burning everything I owned," Peter continued. "A chair, shelving. 2 days ago I burned the shelving." He looked at the heater. "And this thing, what, 2 fires a day?" "3 during the storm, morning, midday, evening." "3!" Peter shook his head slowly, not in disbelief exactly, more like a man recalculating something he thought he understood. "How much wood?" Donovan spoke before Gareth could. 312 pounds, 4 days. Everyone in the room knew what the other number was, or could estimate it. Donovan looked at Langford. Langford looked at the table. "I burned 648, Langford said, "and I have the best-built cabin in the settlement." The number sat in the room. Edvard Halverson, who had not spoken since arriving, said, "We burned everything we had and the fire still went out." He said it without anger, just as a fact about the recent past that he was still organizing. "The wet wood," Donovan said. "The wet wood was the end of it," Edvard said. "But we were already, even before the wood got wet, we were going through it too fast. We knew we were going through it too fast." He looked at Gareth. "How does the stone not go cold?" "Through 78 hours of that." Gareth thought about how to explain it briefly. The stone holds heat differently from air. Air loses heat fast. Stone loses it slowly. Once the stone is charged to temperature, it releases heat for 12 to 18 hours before it needs to be recharged. The earth around the room insulates against the outside cold. So instead of fighting -38 from the outside in, the room is fighting against 34 degrees from the earth side and whatever the room temperature adds from the stone side. The gap is much smaller. Edvard listened, nodded once. "So the earth is doing half the work. More than half. And nobody—" Edvard stopped, started again. "Nobody thought to use that before. People have, in other places. Different forms." Gareth paused. "Not here," Langford said without looking up. "I've seen versions of Earth sheltering in the South Territories. I dismissed it as a technique specific to milder climates." A pause. "I was working from the wrong reference." The room was quiet. Margaret Austin arrived in the early afternoon. She came with a specific purpose and announced it directly, the way she announced everything. She had 2 children who had been coughing since November, and one of them had developed a fever during the storm that had not broken. She was not asking for anything. She was stating a situation. "The cabin air," she said. "It's dry and it's smoky, and it's been 40 degrees at night for 4 days, even with the fire." She looked around the room. "This air is different." She was right. The air in the hillside room was different from cabin air in a way that was immediately apparent to anyone paying attention. No smoke smell, no dry, scorched quality of air that had been cycled through a fireplace repeatedly. The passive ventilation system, cold air in through the lower pipe, warm air out through the upper pipe, was doing a slow, continuous exchange that maintained air quality without the smoke infiltration that plagued conventional fireplaces when wind conditions changed. The temperature held steady. The humidity from the earth walls and the lack of a large open fireplace drawing moisture out of the air was higher than in a cabin. Not damp, stable. "How long has the child had the fever?" Gareth asked. 3 days. "Bring her here." Margaret looked at him. "The room will hold 2 more people without any change to the heating load," Gareth said. "If the cabin air is making it worse, it's not your responsibility." "No?" He picked up his coat. "I'll help you carry her." Donovan moved toward his own coat. Langford stood up. Margaret looked at the 3 of them. She said, "All right," and went back to the entrance. They brought the child, a girl of about 7, named Clara, wrapped in blankets and barely conscious, her breathing shallow, to the hillside home on a sled that afternoon. They laid her on Gareth's sleeping pallet near the heater. She was moved into the warm, clean-aired room and given water and covered in blankets and left to sleep. Within 2 hours, her breathing had deepened. Not recovered, not immediately better in any dramatic way, but the particular shallow, effortful quality of her breathing, the sound of lungs working too hard in air that was too dry and too cold and too used, that sound changed, became slower, more regular. Margaret sat beside her and did not leave. Nobody in the room said anything about what the change in breathing meant. They didn't need to. Margaret knew what it meant. Donovan knew. The Halverson brothers, who had watched their own mother struggle through a winter lung sickness 8 years prior, knew. Langford stood near the entrance for a while, coat still on, and then took his coat off and sat back down. Late in the afternoon, when the light through the south vent had gone to the flat gray of early dusk, Langford asked to see the journal. Gareth handed it to him. Langford read for a long time. He read the October calculations, the thermal mass design, the estimated discharge rates. He read the failure records, the ceiling crack on day 23, the channel joint separations on day 11, the floor settlement and the 4-day cold repair period. He read the daily temperature logs, the firing times, the wood consumption numbers recorded against the outside temperature estimates. He turned a page and found the entry from 2 days into the storm. Exterior thermometer. Glass failure from thermal contraction. Estimated outside temperature below instrument range. Instrument rated to -38 Fahrenheit. He read that entry twice. Then he turned to the storm period logs. The temperature readings every 2 hours. The 3 daily firings, duration noted, stone surface temperature noted before and after each firing. The room temperature holding within a 6-degree band, 46 at the lowest point, 53 at the highest, across 4 continuous days of conditions that had broken glass. He set the journal down on the table. He looked at the heater, at the ceiling, at the floor. He picked up the journal again and turned back to the failure records. He read the ceiling entry, then the channel entry, then the floor entry. He looked at the repair methods, the fiber clay mixture, the ash clay joint compound, the multi-layer substrate packing with staged load settling. He put the journal down a second time. "You documented every failure," he said. "Yes." "Before the repair?" "Before and after." Langford looked at the ceiling, at the fiber clay patch, visible, honestly visible, not concealed or blended to look like original material. A repair that showed itself for what it was. "I want to copy these notes," he said. Gareth looked at him. "Not—" Langford paused. "I want to understand what failed and why. For my own purposes." "You can have the journal," Gareth said. "I'll make another." Langford shook his head. "I'll copy the relevant sections." He paused again. "By hand. I want to write it out myself." He pulled a folded paper from his coat, the kind of paper a builder carried for measurements and calculations, and smoothed it on the table. He opened the journal to the failure records. He began to write. Nobody remarked on this. Donovan was tending the fire. The Halverson brothers were sitting against the south wall, talking quietly. Margaret was beside Clara, whose breathing had continued to slow and deepen into something that sounded closer to ordinary sleep. Gareth watched Langford write for a moment. Then he went to his wood stack and began splitting tomorrow's firing load, working in the alcove beside the entrance where there was room to swing the axe without disturbing anyone. The sound of the axe was regular, clean, the sound of work that knew what it was for. By evening, 6 people were in the hillside room. The room held 51 degrees. The evening firing had been completed. The stone surface read 87. Normal operating temperature, normal firing duration. No deviation from the pre-storm pattern despite 4 days of severe stress on the system. Langford finished copying. He folded the papers and put them in his coat. He looked at what he had written. At the heater. At Clara sleeping. He said to no one specifically, "In the coldest week of the storm, this room held a 6-degree range. My cabin held a 40-degree range." Donovan said, "I know." "A 6-degree range," Langford said again. Not for emphasis. More like he was making sure he had said it out loud, that it had entered the air and become real in that way. Nobody responded. Langford stood up. He put his coat on. He looked at Gareth, who had come back in from the alcove and was stacking the split wood along the east wall. He said, "I'm going to build one." Gareth set a piece of wood on the stack. "I'll need to ask you questions," Langford said. "I know," Gareth said. Langford nodded once. He pulled his coat closed. He went to the entrance and turned the right-angle corner and opened the timber door and stepped out into the dark and the cold. The door closed. Donovan looked at this closed door. Then he looked at Gareth. Gareth stacked another piece of wood. Outside in the dark, the sound of Langford's footsteps in the snow moved away from the hillside. They moved in the direction of the settlement. Then they stopped. There was a silence. Then the sound of footsteps again, but different. Not returning to the settlement, moving around the base of the hill at a slow, deliberate pace. He was walking the perimeter of the hill, taking measurements in the dark, by pace count, committing to memory the dimensions of the site, the south-facing slope, the angle of approach, the way the hill blocked the northwest wind, walking it the way a man walks a site he has decided to build on. Inside the hillside room, nobody knew this. The timber door was closed. The stone held its heat. Clara breathed in the slow rhythm of ordinary sleep, and Margaret sat beside her in the warmth, and the lamp burned steady on the table where Langford's empty chair still held the slight compression of a man who had spent an hour writing down everything he had previously decided not to learn. He worked alone for the first 3 days, not because he needed to. The Halverson brothers had offered. Donovan had offered. But because a man who has spent 20 years building things a certain way needs time alone with a new idea before he can share it without defensiveness. He dug with the same mattock Gareth had used, purchased from the same trading post. And he dug slowly because he was thinking while he dug, and the thinking required space. He had spent the 2 months since the storm in a particular state, not converted, not enthusiastic, not any of the words that might suggest an emotion had overtaken his judgment. He had been methodical. He had read Gareth's copied notes until the paper wore soft at the folds. He had visited the hillside home 11 times, each visit with a specific question, each question generating a specific answer that he then tested against his own understanding of construction until the answer either held or revealed a further question. He had built a small test structure on the north side of his property, a scaled section of masonry channel heater, 3 feet long, to understand the firing dynamics before committing to a full build. He had burned it 47 times and taken measurements after each firing. He had arrived at his own conclusions, which were mostly the same as Gareth's conclusions, and in 2 cases were refinements. The entrance angle, Langford had determined, could be optimized. Not 90 degrees, but 110, a slightly wider turn that was easier to navigate with a load while still breaking the wind infiltration effectively. He had modeled this with a small-scale wood mock-up and confirmed it with airflow testing using a candle. He told Gareth about it on his 9th visit. Gareth had looked at the numbers, said, "That's better than what I did." He said it without qualification. Langford had written that down too. By the end of April, Langford's hillside home was enclosed. By June, the heater was operational. He fired it for the first time on a mild summer evening when the outside temperature was 58 degrees, just to understand the system's behavior when the differential was small. The stone mass reached peak temperature in 38 minutes. He noted this was 6 minutes faster than Gareth's system, which he attributed to a modification in the channel geometry, a slight narrowing in the midsection that increased gas velocity and improved heat transfer to the stone. He spent the summer refining. By October 1883, when the cold returned to Blackstone Ridge, 2 hillside homes sat on the south-facing slopes above the settlement. The Halverson brothers began their excavation in July of 1883. They did not ask Langford for help, but Langford showed up on the 3rd day with his own tools and worked beside them without being asked. He did not direct. He answered questions when they had questions and otherwise worked alongside them the way an experienced craftsman works beside an apprentice. Present, available, not overbearing. Peter Halverson had a question about the substrate packing that Langford couldn't answer from his own experience. They walked together to Gareth's hillside home, and Peter asked Gareth directly, and Gareth spent 40 minutes on the floor of his room demonstrating the layered packing technique with a section of loose substrate he had kept specifically because he expected to need to show it to someone. By the winter of 1883, 4 hillside homes stood on the ridge. By the winter of 1884, 9. The growth was not uniform or organized. It did not proceed from any central plan or common agreement. It moved the way useful things move through a community of practical people. From direct observation and direct need, person to person, each person modifying what they received based on their own site conditions and their own understanding. The Macready family built theirs into a granite outcrop rather than soft soil, which required a different sealing approach entirely, timber-framed rather than earth-packed. And the solution they developed for that particular condition became the standard approach for hard substrate sites for the next decade. Margaret Austin built hers with a second ventilation channel that allowed for adjustable airflow, a modification she had thought of while nursing Clara through that first winter, and observing that the air quality in the room changed when Gareth adjusted the pipe openings. Clara, who recovered fully by February and spent the remaining winter months in the hillside home, while her mother built what would become their permanent residence, grew up in an earth-sheltered home and did not think of it as unusual. It was simply what homes were. She was 7 years old when it saved her life, and she did not know that, and no one told her, because what would be the point of telling a child that? By 1887, the technique had a name. Nobody decided on the name. It emerged the way names emerge in communities, from repeated use, from the need to refer to something quickly, from the gradual agreement of practical people who found that one phrase worked better than others. They called it ridge building, sometimes hollow hill building in the older generation. The younger settlers who had grown up with it simply called it building, the way any generation calls the normal thing by the shortest available name. Victor Langford, who by 1886 had built 6 hillside homes for other families in addition to his own, had developed a set of written specifications. Not published, he didn't print or distribute them formally. They existed as a document that he showed to people who came to him with questions, and that people who came to him copied by hand, and that their copies were copied again, so that by 1889 versions of Langford's specifications were circulating in 3 adjacent territories, some of them several generations of handwriting removed from the original. The specifications listed the key dimensions: the heater channel geometry and firing protocols, the substrate packing procedure, the multi-layer approach with staged load settling that Gareth had developed from the floor failure, the fiber clay ceiling joint compound, with the fiber ratio specified to 2 decimal places. The entrance angle, 110 degrees, Langford's refinement, attributed in the document to no one, simply listed as the correct number. On the first page of the specifications, in Langford's careful builder's handwriting, was a single line he had added in the second version and never removed. This system was developed by observation and failure in equal measure. The failures are as important as the numbers. He had not discussed this addition with Gareth before including it. He had not told Gareth it was there. Gareth read it on a day in 1887 when Langford left the specifications document at the hillside home after a visit, and Gareth picked it up from the table and looked through it. He read the first page and set the document down and went back to what he had been doing. He did not mention it to Langford the next time they saw each other. Some things did not require acknowledgement to be understood. Gareth expanded the hillside home in 1885. He cut east into the hill and added a second room connected to the first by a short interior passage. The second room he used primarily for storage and for work, a place to maintain his trapping equipment through the winter without bringing the smell of rendered fat and cured hide into the living space. He added a second heater in the new room, smaller, fired less frequently, sufficient to keep the space above freezing without maintaining the full temperature of the main room. He did not expand again after that. The home he had built was sufficient for the life he was living, and he was not interested in space beyond sufficiency. He had a sleeping area, a work table, the heater, the cooking stove, the south vent that brought in pale winter light for 4 hours each afternoon. His wood stack for the winter of 1888 was 380 pounds, which was his total consumption for the previous winter plus a 15% reserve. He split it in September and stacked it in the alcove and did not think about it again until the cold came. He was in his late 40s by then. The knees that had spent years on frozen ground doing trapline work had opinions about cold mornings that they had not had in his 30s, and the hillside home accommodated those opinions better than any above-ground structure would have. The floor, the mortared creekstone, was warmer than any wooden floor in any cabin in the territory. He woke each morning to a room in the 40s and fired the heater and ate breakfast in a room climbing steadily toward 50, and did not think much about the fact that outside the temperature was doing whatever it was doing. He maintained the journal. By 1888, it was the third journal, the first 2 filled, stored in a waterproof tin under the sleeping platform. He continued recording temperatures, firing times, wood consumption, any anomaly in the system's behavior. The third journal also contained observations on other people's builds, notes from his visits to the Halverson home, to Langford's place, to the McCready granite substrate build. Not criticism. Comparative data. The way a scientist records variations between experiments. He had not intended to become a scientist. He had intended to be warm. The first person to build a ridge home without ever meeting Gareth Holloway was a young woman named Signa Brandt, who arrived in Blackstone Ridge in the spring of 1890 with her husband and 2 children. She had read a third-generation copy of Langford's specifications in the territory to the south, where the technique had spread through a settlement that had never heard the name Gareth Holloway. She knew the system as something her neighbor had built, which her neighbor had learned from a man passing through, which that man had learned from a written document that mentioned no originator. She and her husband broke ground in June of 1890. She had questions that the specifications didn't answer about her particular site, a north-northwest facing slope rather than the preferred south face, a difficult compromise forced by land allocation, and someone in the settlement told her to go talk to the man who built the first one. She found Gareth at the hillside home on a Wednesday afternoon. She was 31 years old, precise and practical, and she explained her site problem without preamble and asked what modifications the specifications would require for a north-northwest exposure. Gareth listened, asked 2 questions about the site, then told her about compensating with a deeper entrance alcove and a different ventilation pipe angle to account for the prevailing wind coming from a different direction relative to the structure. She took notes. At the end, she said, "How long have you been doing this? Building this way? 8 years? The specifications. Did you write those?" Langford wrote them. "But the system," Gareth was quiet for a moment. "The system started here. It's gone to different places and come back different. The version you have is better than what I built." Sina looked at the hillside home, at the south-facing slope, the entrance, the vent pipes on the hillside above. "Is this the original?" she asked. "Yes." She looked at it for another moment. Then she thanked him and left and went back to her site and began modifying her plans according to what he told her. Her north-northwest build was completed in October 1890. The modifications worked. The first winter, she burned 412 pounds of hardwood, higher than a south-facing build, lower than any conventional cabin in the settlement. The following spring, she wrote her own addendum to the specifications, a single page describing the modifications for non-south-facing sites, and gave it to Langford, who added it to the document as Appendix A. Her name was on it. Langford had insisted on that. The original hillside home is still standing. This is not a metaphor. The structure that Gareth Holloway cut into the hillside in the spring of 1882, the room 12 feet by 16, the masonry channel heater, the entrance passage with its 110-degree turn that Langford suggested and Gareth retrofitted in the winter of 1884, that structure exists. The timber crosspieces are not the original timber. They were replaced twice, in 1891 and again in 1903, using the same species of dense pine from the lower slope, cut and cured the same way. The fiber clay ceiling packing has been reapplied 4 times. The floor stones have been re-leveled once in 1897, when a section of the east end settled again, a different section than the original failure, a fact that the person who repaired it found interesting and noted in the margin of the third journal, which was still in the waterproof tin under the sleeping platform where Gareth had put it. The heater is partially original. The stone mass is unchanged. The same 1,800 pounds of schist and granite that Gareth assembled in the summer of 1882 moved twice and reassembled without any of the stones being replaced. The iron firebox door is not the original. The original hinge failed in 1895 and was replaced with a heavier model. But the firebox itself, the fitted stone box, is the same stone in the same configuration. The entrance passage still has the rope, not Gareth's original rope. That was replaced at some point. The record of when is unclear. But a rope, running from the interior sleeping area to the timber door, in the location and function that Margaret Austin suggested on a September afternoon in 1882, when she came to talk to him practically rather than to tell him he was wrong. The rope has been replaced multiple times. The practice of having the rope has never been discontinued. Whoever lives in the hillside home now keeps the rope, and they probably don't know why. They keep it because it was there when they arrived, because it was there for the people who lived there before them, because at some point in the chain of occupancy the rope became part of what the home was, and nobody saw a reason to remove it. A pragmatic artifact. A memory that became a habit, that became a feature. The principles that Gareth worked out in the winter of 1882 are not historical curiosities. Earth sheltering, the deliberate use of soil mass as thermal insulation, is among the most energy-efficient building approaches available in cold climates. The physics have not changed. Soil at depth maintains a stable temperature regardless of surface conditions. The thermal mass principle, storing heat in dense material and releasing it slowly, underlies the design of passive solar buildings, rammed earth construction, and high-efficiency masonry heaters used in Northern Europe and North America today. Fiber-reinforced clay is a standard material in sustainable construction. Staged substrate packing under load is a foundational concept in earthworks engineering. None of these modern applications trace their lineage to a hillside in Blackstone Ridge. They don't need to. The physics were true before 1882, and they are true now, and they will be true after every building standing today has been replaced by something else. What Gareth did was not discover these principles. He observed them, trusted them over accepted practice, and built a life around them when everyone around him was certain he was wrong. The difference between knowing a principle and building your life on it is the distance between a diagram and a room you can sleep in. Clara Austin grew up and built her own home, and her children grew up in it, and her grandchildren played in the entrance passage of the original hillside home on a summer afternoon in 1931, when the structure was 49 years old and the heater, cold in July, still radiated a faint mineral warmth if you held your palm to the stone. One of those grandchildren asked whose house it was. The adult with them said it was an old house, that someone had built it a long time ago. The child pressed their palm to the heater stone and held it there. "It's still warm," the child said. The adult said yes. That's how it works, the stone remembers. Gareth Holloway lived in the hillside home until 1911. He was in his middle 60s by then, and the knees had reached a point where they had stopped offering opinions and started issuing demands, and the trapline work had ended a decade prior. He had spent his later years doing what he had always done, which was observe, and what observation had shifted toward in his 60s was the building work being done across the ridge and the territories beyond it. The variations on his original design, the refinements Langford had developed, Cenabrant's north-facing modifications, the granite substrate approach the Macreadys had invented, and that had now been used on at least 30 builds in hard substrate sites across 3 territories. He kept adding to the journal until 1909. The third journal ran out of pages in March of that year, and he did not buy a fourth. There were 3 journals in the waterproof tin, which was sufficient. He did not leave the hillside home willingly. He left because a winter came when the firing schedule was beyond what his hands could consistently manage. The arthritis in the right hand had progressed to where splitting wood was painful in a way he could not negotiate with anymore. And Donovan, who was 72 and still sharp in the way that men who have spent their lives paying attention tend to remain sharp, came to him in November and said without preamble that he was going to spend the winter with his daughter's family in the valley and that Gareth should come. Gareth looked at the heater, at the rope on the door, at the thermometer on the south wall. "Who'll fire it?" he said. "The Halverson boy. Peter's son. He knows the system." Gareth thought about this. "The channel joints need checking every 4 days. I'll tell him." A pause. "The fiber clay on the north ceiling section," Gareth said. "It's been 4 years since the last application. It'll want attention before spring. I'll tell him that too." Gareth looked around the room, at the stone that had held heat through 83 winters, at the floor he had re-leveled on his hands and knees in December 1882 with frozen fingers, at the low ceiling that had cracked and been repaired and had not cracked again. He said, "All right." He packed what he needed into a canvas bag. He took the 3 journals in their tin. He took the thermometer from the south wall. He had replaced it twice, but the mounting bracket was original, cut from a piece of strap iron on the first day he moved in, and he left the bracket on the wall. He left everything else. At the entrance he stopped. He looked back at the room one more time, at the heater, cold at this hour, waiting for the morning firing that someone else would now give it. He did not say anything. He went through the entrance passage, made the turn, pushed the timber door open, and stepped out into the November air. He spent his final years in the valley, in a small above-ground house that was warm enough and not what he was used to. He died in 1914 at an age that was either 68 or 71, depending on which record you consulted, in a bed that was warm, in a room that was adequate. He left nothing except the 3 journals, which passed to Langford's Specifications Archive. and were eventually bound together with the specifications document and Signebrandt's appendix and the Macready granite notes and several other additions into a single volume that circulated through the Ridge settlements for the next 3 decades, and that a building historian found in a private collection in 1962 and described as the most complete primary record of vernacular earth-sheltered construction in the Northern Territories. The historian did not know, reading it, that most of the journal entries had been written by lamplight in a room at 50 degrees while outside the temperature broke the instruments. He knew what the numbers said. He didn't know what it had taken to get them. What people worship as innovation is often just observation that arrived before everyone else was ready. Sometimes the earth beneath your feet knows more about surviving winter than any wall you could build above it.